What is process theology? It's so strange to try to say in a few words something that informs the whole way you live out your existence, but let me try it. Process theology for me can be said in 3 sentences, which then must be unpacked. Reality is relational, through and through relational. The second sentence is relations are internal to who we are and not external. And the third, and if that's true of us as human beings, we're not an exception in this universe, that we are part and parcel of it. We belong to this world, to this universe, and that which is true of us is true of all existence. Reality is relational, whether we speak of human reality or particles of light or a chair or a rug or God. Reality is relational through and through. I'd like to illustrate that through a piece of experience of mine that may tie into some of your own, and that has to do with a particular relation that was very, very important to me and, in fact, still is. Now, the peculiarity, perhaps, of it still being important to me is that I'm speaking about a relation with a person who is now dead. My mother and I were friends. For many long years we were friends. Our relationship went through all of the changes of childhood, you know, moving into the teenage and the usual separation and all of that, and finally into the adult years of a friendship. But my mother lived far away from me. She lived in another part of the country, and so our friendship was conducted through telephones and through letters and through thoughts primarily. We seldom had the opportunity to sit down and talk together face to face. Most of our relating then in those final years was through the means of external realities, the telephone wires, the postal system. And last summer, my mother died, and that friendship came to an end. And as is usually the case, other friends would speak to me about that loss and comfort and presence, and I would tell them about my mother. And of course, it seemed to me that the most important thing about that relationship was really the depth of the love that was between us. But I found it sort of stuck in my throat when I would try to say that I had loved my mother, as if it were in the past tense, because the strange thing was, it wasn't past tense. And my mind would tell me, well, it has to be past tense. After all, your mother's dead. She's no longer there. You loved her. You loved her when she was alive. And I realized that that wasn't true. Or it was true. I did love her when she was alive, but that loving her was so much a part of who I am that love continues in me. It's refracted now in different ways. It's no longer that I love my mother in Dallas, but my love for my mother has now permeated my reality and my relationships with other people in ways that I had not anticipated, and yet in ways which were perhaps there all along. Loving my mother was not external to me, like a garment I could put on or take off, but loving my mother was internal to who I am, affecting the whole quality of my existence. Now, if the relationship with my mother is an internal relation affecting the depth of me, and not the externality of me, that is not so different from every other aspect of my existence. Relationships are internal. The difference is in importance. That is, it's obvious. Since it was such a special relationship that of course it was more profound, more noticeable, a greater impact when the loss of my mother occurred. And yet, my whole existence is comprised of relationships. Not just that I am buffeted by all of these relationships any more than I was buffeted by the relationship to my mother. I respond to my mother creatively. I wove the feelings from my mother into the rest of who I am, integrated them into my day. Doesn't mean I went around constantly thinking, I love my mother, I am in relationship to my mother, and that dominated my thinking. But it was an aspect, always integrated into who I am, in conjunction with many other things. And some would rise to importance one day and others to another. But all of my relationships enter into who I am. I weave them into the duties and responsibilities and activities, enjoyments of the moment, and become myself in every new moment. Reality is relational. Relations are internal to ourselves, not external to ourselves. Some are indeed more noticeable than others, but in fact, all are operative. That's true for human existence. It's true for all existence. Perhaps the emotional tonality that comes into our human relationships may be of a different kind. I do not know. I am only human. But relations are internal to all existence. Now, the theological implication of that is simply this. If God exists, then God is also relational. And the relationality which qualifies God is internal to who God is and not external to who God is, not taken off as a mantle, sort of the robe of majesty that you put on when you're being king of the universe and then take off when you're off being your own self. That kind of imagery just, of course, is absurd. It doesn't apply. If reality is relational, then it's relational for God as well. What does it mean if God exists in relation in an essential sort of a way? With whom is God in relation? God is in relation with everything else that exists. What else exists? Well, we know some of them. There's a universe. There's ourselves. There is a puff of smoke. There are great vast societies. There are tiny little molecules. God's existence is in relation to everything else which exists. And God is affected by everything else which exists. One thing it says is, I exist, I make a difference to God, I have an effect upon God, I matter. I matter to God. I matter, in fact, throughout the universe. I have an effect. I matter. What is my effect upon God? God receives who I am into God's own self. And then God is not a passive, existing through the whim of what I happen to do. But God integrates who I am within the whole divine nature. And through that integration into who God is, God gives back an effect upon me. So that God and I are in relation. I affect God and matter to the whole divine existence. God can handle me. God can integrate me transformatively into the divine nature. And then God can give back to me a redemptive influence so that I might have guidance, strength, redemption, hope in every moment of my existence. Now, how would that work? I spoke about my mother and the death of my mother. I am in relation to my mother, and who my mother is has a deep effect upon me. The loss of my mother is grief. Of course it is grief. If you take this notion of a relational existence and then suggest that God too is in relation, that we matter, that we have an effect upon God, myself, in my moment of grief, has an effect upon God, so that God feels my grief. Externally, as something which happens as a matter of ho-hum incidents? No. Oddly enough, internally. How can God be affected by me? Wouldn't that mean that, God certainly is much greater than me, certainly too great to be affected by the vagaries of a woman in grief over the loss of her mother. But if God is in relation to everything which exists, that means even me, that God is great enough even to be in relationship to me. So yes, my grief has an effect upon God. That God feels my grief transformatively, integrates it with all the resources of God's own self, and then through that integration gives back to me the form of help that I need in that moment of grief. What is the form of help? Maybe no more than a way of dealing with my anger and pain. God is great enough to feel my anger and pain. A sense that God is with me no matter what. Sometimes the worst thing about pain and grief is the loneliness of it, especially when it's grief over the loss of someone you love. There is presence in that moment of loneliness, and it's the presence of God, relational, understanding, feeling, giving back strength at that very moment. So you see, understanding God is present with me relationally, as I am, as God is, in every moment of existence, becomes a resource for every exigency of existence whatsoever. God is an ever-present help. So one can start. What is process? Process is relation. Relations are internal, and it qualifies all existence whatsoever. But the existential import of those three dry sentences are such that there is an ever-present resource for me, wherever I am, whenever I am, however I am. There is a power for help. God is an ever-constant presence, relationally, with even me, even everything. even you. Existence matters to God.